Hey everyone, welcome to the I Heart Podcast. My name is Jonathan North, and this week I heart silent films. Last year when I wanted to branch out with my YouTube content, I started a series called I Heart Animation, which was basically a shorter predecessor to this podcast just focusing on animation. Before I started filming episodes, I reached out to some friends in my online animation circle to see if I could get some guests, and one of the first people I messaged was Eli Sanza. And maybe I wasn't clear enough about what the show is about, but his first choice for a movie to talk about was the 1922 silent film Nosferatu. Now that wasn't exactly something I wanted to cover for I Heart Animation, but I had some other series in mind for the future, including one that I was potentially going to call the Monster Movie Marathon, so I told him as soon as I started that, we'd cover Nosferatu. At that point, I hadn't even thought about doing a podcast, but since that's now the main thing I do, and my podcast is pretty random, I thought it'd be the perfect place to cover an old silent horror film from the early days of cinema. And who knows, maybe this will end up being the first episode of a Monster Movie Marathon. Either way, this week we're looking at Nosferatu with Eli Sanza. Why don't you tell me why you wanted to talk about this movie specifically?
Okay, the movie that we're talking about is Nosferatu, and it's an interesting film because it came out in 1922, and it was the first ever horror movie. It's the oldest horror movie that I've ever seen, and a lot of horror movies that followed it. It seems like you can sort of trace what they did back to this movie. Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, it seems like that it's a cool one to talk about because it's kind of like the start of a lot of horror movie tropes. And it's kind of like the forefather of a genre.
I could see that. I think for me, this didn't really feel like a horror film. And
yeah.
I think that's probably just because it's so old that I'm kind of jaded. I've seen too many things that are like a lot scarier, so it didn't really feel at all horrific to me. But as I was watching it, I was trying to think of how people back then might think about it, because they wouldn't have seen like CGI, they wouldn't have seen practical animatronic effects, they wouldn't have seen anything that we have today that helps to make horror movies scary. So everything that they're seeing in this movie would be brand new to them. So trying to think of it in that context, I guess I could see how some of it could be scary to them.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying because a lot of silent films from the 20s don't hold up that well. Mm-hmm. And yeah, well, there are a lot of horror movies that have come out since that I can definitely say are way scarier and do a way better job. But the thing about this is that it is so long ago, and it was so close to when movies in general were just starting out as a brand new storytelling medium, that I can forgive its flaws a little bit, because it's like, okay, it was so long ago. It's like they were still trying to figure out how to make horror movies back then. And in that regard, it's kind of, you could sort of see it being like scarier back then than it would be now, because like no one had ever seen a lot of horror movies back then.
Mm-hmm. So as I was watching this, I kept seeing some inconsistencies, so I started looking on Wikipedia, and I think that the version I watched was not a good version, because apparently there's a whole bunch of different versions floating around, and different ones make different changes to the original film. So the one that I watched was right off the bat really confusing, because they were calling him Count Dracula, and I already knew that this was a rip-off, like a fan fiction of Dracula, but I had assumed that they changed the name. Like, it's called Nosferatu, so I was assuming that that's just the vampire's name. But then they're calling him Count Dracula in the movie, And I started looking around. I realized I think that this is a later version that tried to turn it back into a Dracula film, because on the Wikipedia page they're calling him Count Orlok, which is another weird name. Like, I just assumed that Nosferatu was the name of the vampire, but I guess that's just what the vampire species is called. I don't know. I was kind of confused. And there were so many weird things about this that made it feel off. And I feel like I need to watch it again, except find a better version to watch.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the thing that you said about how the Wikipedia page said that the characters' names were different from the version that you saw. Yeah, that the Wikipedia is talking about the names of the characters from the German version of the movie, and the version that you watched was the version that was released in America. And you're right, they did change the name of Count Orlok to Dracula, and they changed the city that the movie takes place in from, like, I think it was called like Wisburg, and that was a fictional place, but it actually took place in Bremen in the American release. I think, so I think the version that you watched, so they changed all the characters' names, and there are several versions of the movie that came out after 1922, and including that one. So they can be confusing because there are inconsistencies due to like the different releases. But the version that I watched, I think, is the same version that you watched. So at least if we're both talking about, I'm pretty sure we're both going to be talking about the same movie, because I also saw the version with Dracula, and where the character was called Dracula, although he wasn't originally supposed to be Dracula. That was America's choice to make him into Dracula, to make the story similar to the novel that the movie was based on.
Yeah, another thing that I noticed was something I read online. I think it was in like the comments, because I watched this on Amazon Prime Video. So I was reading the comments underneath, seeing what people were saying, and they were talking about the lighting was off, because apparently they originally were tinting scenes that took place at night to be blue, and everything in this was just black and white. So, I mean, I guess they filmed everything during the day, and they were just tinting things blue later. So everything just felt like it was taking place during the day. And because of the way the story works, the way the vampire powers work, they have to be awake at night. So I'm assuming that even though most of this felt like it took place during the day, it was supposed to be happening at night, especially toward the end.
Yeah, it was. You're right. Like, watching this movie, the lighting was so dark. It felt like I couldn't tell if it was taking place at night or in the daytime, like throughout the production, and I just had to pretty much suspend like disbelief to a higher level than usual to follow along with the fact that the ending of the movie had to take place in daytime in order for Dracula to be defeated. But I literally couldn't tell if it was night or day during the entire thing, because like you said, it was hard to tell in black and white, especially the older the movie is, because the older the movie is, the harder it is to tell what is happening visually, because it's just such poor quality.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that I just kept getting confused by. I think a lot of it also had to do with the limitations of the silent film, because they only have like the cards with the words on it every so often. So I was just trying to fill in the gaps of what all was happening when they weren't putting up a card to read. And eventually I just kept going back and forth between the movie and the Wikipedia page, trying to keep myself up to speed with what was going on.
Yeah, those. I'm kind of a student of film history, so I've watched a lot of old films, and I've seen a lot of silent films that have title cards to explain what's happening, and that happens a lot when you watch a lot of old movies. Mm-hmm. That they don't always say what the characters are saying. Sometimes they just leave it completely up to your imagination. And I've just learned to accept that and just accept the fact that, well, if they wanted me to know what they were saying, I guess they would tell me. I guess it's not important. And usually, in order for that to work, the story has to be simplistic. And thankfully, a lot of silent films had simplistic stories. And so a basic understanding of what was happening was essential in order for a silent film to be watchable. And this movie it's not flawless, but I understood it enough to be into it and to end up enjoying it. I don't know if you liked it as much as I did, but I was satisfied.
I enjoyed some of the, design choices, like the imagery that was in it. That's probably about as far as I can go as to saying that I enjoyed part of it, because a lot of it I was just kind of confused. I felt like before, my cousin Sarah and I have watched a bunch of old silent versions of Alice in Wonderland and A Christmas Carol. And just about every time we watch a different version, one of the things that we always think of is this is really only watchable by someone who has already read this book. Because they really just seem like a collection of scenes showing off different parts of the book rather than a true fleshed out narrative. And this was a little bit closer to a fleshed out narrative, but it was still confusing enough to me because I've never read the book Dracula. I'm not really big into that kind of a story, so I've never really sought it out. So to just sit down and watch this version with no prior knowledge of anything that was going on probably was my biggest problem, because I was really having trouble figuring out some of the story that was happening.
Yeah, I have a feeling that if you read the novel that this movie is based on by Bram Stoker, it would be a lot more enjoyable because a lot of the things you see in the movie, you can tell that they felt like versions of something, not originated from the movie. It felt like you were watching something that originated from something else, because everything that was taking place in the story felt like it could have been better than what the movie was making, what the movie was putting on screen. And that happens a lot of times with movies based on books. And this one, a lot of the stuff in this movie actually felt like one of the problems I thought with it was that it wasn't fleshed out. Fleshing out the characters is something that books are really good at, and you could sort of feel the weakness in the translation because it felt it's a kind of a short movie. It's only like around 70 minutes, and it felt like it was a trimmed down version of something more epic. It could have been better.
Yeah, it was pretty short, but I think I was fine with that because, like I said, half the time I was slightly confused, and I don't know if I would have wanted to watch it if it were 2 hours long. I would just be looking at my watch the entire time, is this about over?
Yeah, no, I was merciful in choosing something like this because I know that these movies can be kind of boring, especially since something like this is kind of like this gothic silent horror film. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and so I knew that not everyone is going to like it. But I do like what you said about the design, about how you liked how the movie looked, because that was one of the things I liked most about this movie, is the design, because it was one of the earliest examples of German expressionism, and the German expressionism was a kind of abstract, stylish, kind of less realistic and more wacky kind of like art style that originated in Germany, and like right around after World War One. When everyone in Germany was kind of sad after World War One happened, so in order to like reflect their big emotional feelings about that period in German history, the art was reflecting it by being loud and anxious and big and dramatic, and that was expressed in a lot of German films that were made by the guy who directed this movie, like Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, F.W. Murnau, as he's most famously known. And all his films I really love because of the art style, because I really love German Expressionism and the art that came from Germany in this period. And it was really kind of an important kind of filmmaking style because it influenced American films too. And it was like a kind of a far-reaching influence. That was something I really enjoyed about it.
Yeah, you could see, I could pick out things here and there that I think people have either paid homage to or used as parody in different things, especially like the shadow going up the stairs, just things like that, just little details that I recognized.
Yeah, you know what? Walt Disney, I found out, was a fan of German Expressionism, and you could actually see influences from that style in some of his animated films, like in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You know that scene where Snow White is like running through the forest right after the huntsman is about to kill her, but she's running. And you could see like all of these eyes that were staring at her in the forest, and it was a really scary chase scene where she was being chased by nothing, but it was still scary because it was in her mind. She felt like she was being watched, and she was feeling overwhelmed by what was happening, even though there was nothing happening. It was just it was like psychological. It was based on her feelings. That was where the drama in that moment was coming from. And that is a filmmaking technique that originated in Germany, because that is what German Expressionism is. It's storytelling through characters' psychological feelings, not through action, but like through what the character's thinking. That was one of the things that Walt Disney learned from that filmmaking style.
Yeah, I can see that, because a lot of the movie, you could tell that it was more about the atmosphere than the story. Like there was one scene in particular where like it's mostly all black and you can't really tell what's going on, but you can just see Count Dracula, Count Orlok, Nosferatu, whatever his name is. He's just kind of down in the corner, like peeking over something. And I was thinking to myself, I don't really find this scary, but for somebody back then who's never seen anything like this, I could just imagine that's probably terrifying, because you could just imagine this creepy, evil rat face peering out of the darkness at you. That probably would be really terrifying for somebody back then.
Yeah, it kind of would be. And like you say, I could tell that based on what filmmakers have learned after the 1920s, you could tell it could have been scarier. But if you watched it back then, Roger Ebert said something interesting about this movie. He said that it wasn't that scary, but it was haunting. He said it was haunting, and that was kind of like what it is. There weren't any jump scares, anything like that, but it sort of had a creepy vibe to it that sort of stuck with you.
I guess we could go through the story briefly, because I guess some people probably won't know what it is about. It's
yes, that's good.
Do you want to just like recount the plot a bit? Because like the first part of it, I was confused by, so maybe you'll be able to explain it better.
Yeah, I'll go through the plot. It's okay. So the movie is it starts out with this. I'm gonna name all the characters. I'm gonna say all the characters under their American names.
Okay.
So there's this estate agent named Renfield who sends his employee named Jonathan Parker. He sends him to Transylvania to visit this new client who wants to move into Bremen. So Harker leaves his wife Nina in the care of his friends Westenra and Lucy. So he's staying with them while he travels to Transylvania, and he stops at this inn, and everyone is scared when he says the name Dracula, and they all try to tell him not to go to Transylvania, and he doesn't listen, and so he visits.
There was one little detail in that scene that at first I was confused by, and then I read the Wikipedia page and it made a little more sense. The people in the inn were talking about they're like being evil spirits at night, and then you see this hyena for some reason. This hyena is like just trotting through the field outside. And I was like, are they trying to pass off a hyena as an evil spirit? And I was thinking, well, like, I guess maybe the people in the 1920s, maybe they probably wouldn't have ever seen a hyena. So maybe that would creep them out for some reason. But then the Wikipedia page was saying that they were talking about a werewolf, which they did not say werewolf at all in the version that I watched. So that was another thing that made this part a bit confusing.
Yeah, that was really confusing. I didn't remember not a werewolf, but that's what Wikipedia said. And who knows? Maybe the hyena as a demon, the hyena as a werewolf. Who knows? It could have made sense either way. It's like I just moved past that because it was too confusing. So then he makes it to Dracula's castle, and he very quickly realizes that Dracula is a weirdo, because like at one point he cuts his finger while he's having dinner, and he starts to bleed. And remember that part when like Dracula was like walking over him toward his bloody finger, and he was like wanted to suck his blood.
I made note of that scene in particular specifically because I said the scene is creepy not because he's a vampire, but because he's an old man coming towards this guy saying, "Your blood, your precious blood." I was like, that's just creepy on a human level rather than a supernatural.
No, yeah, that was beyond supernatural. That had nothing to do with the fact that he was a vampire. That was just anybody could have been creeped out by that, no matter who said that. Then, Harker, he wakes up the next morning. He's got punctures on his neck, and he doesn't understand where they came from. At this point, it's pretty predictable what's happening. I'd be surprised if the audience didn't understand what's happening. It's like, I got these bites on my neck. I guess he writes back to his girlfriend and says that he thinks they're mosquito bites, but it's pretty clear that that guy who was just trying to suck his blood like yesterday is probably the one who did it. Like, that's a safe bet. But the castle is completely abandoned, and he doesn't see where Dracula is. But eventually he finds Dracula sleeping in a coffin, and again he's creeped out, and he eventually escapes the castle. And also, while all this is happening, his girlfriend Nina, who he put in the care of his friends, he's having like this trance, and she's like wakes up from his sleep and is in a trance, and he's like has this vision of what's happening, so he can sort of see that Dracula is like trying to kill her husband, and that's this other like subplot.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of can tell what's happening, even though he sees what's happening. And then also, while he's escaping from the castle, Dracula is moving to that place in Bremen that they were talking about at the beginning of the movie. Dracula's moving there, and he transports himself in the coffin across the sea in a boat. Then that's this other sort of subplot involving involving the sea crew on the boat, that they open the coffin and find that there are a bunch of rats inside, and then they all get infected by what they think is the plague. And once the boat arrives and Dracula carries his coffin over to his new house, and when the boat arrives and the whole crew and the captain and the first mate and everyone is dead, they all think that there's a plague going on. They don't put it together that Dracula is the cause of it. Nosferatu is the cause of it. So they think of the plague. Throughout the movie, Harker and his wife Nina are both reading this book that talks about vampires, and it also talks about how to defeat vampires. And Nina finds out when she reads it that the way to defeat a vampire is for a woman pure of heart to distract him with her beauty all through the night. Like, all through the night, so she invites Dracula in to protect her husband, because she reads in the book, oh, okay, well, if a woman pure of heart can distract Dracula with her beauty, then I'll do that. And so she invites him in, and so he comes into the house, and he actually gets to drink her blood, and it actually happens in the movie. And also, all the while, Renfield, who is the guy who told Harker to go to Transylvania in the first place, the estate agent, it turns out he works for Dracula. He's like Dracula, and he can sort of sense when Dracula's in trouble. And so while Dracula is sucking Nina's blood, he's so into it, like sucking the blood all through the night, about the fact that it was morning soon, so he gets defeated by daylight. And Renfield, Dracula, also can tell that Dracula is defeated because he can sense what Dracula is also feeling. So he also perishes at the same time that Dracula perishes. And Harker finds his wife just in the nick of time, just before Dracula can suck all her blood. So they get to embrace each other right before the movie ends. And that was pretty much it. That was the entire movie. But it was kind of a simplistic plot, but the whole way it was told was sort of this revolutionary thing, because it was like I said, it was like steeped in like stylish like filmmaking and like the creative use of shadows in order to create this like new kind of horror mood. And I actually kind of thought it was a little bit more effective than the Dracula movie from the 30s, like Bela Lugosi, in terms of mood. I don't know which one is better, but the German Expressionism I'm kind of a sucker for. So that one kind of is the better one in my mind.
So at the very end, did his wife die then? Because it seemed like she died just as he got to him, or
Yeah,
like just as he got to the room. It seemed like she died in his arms.
You know, I'm so used to when characters die in movies that there's some kind of like dramatic, like focus on the fact that a character died. But with this movie, it was sort of hard to tell. I think she may have died, but it was almost as if the movie didn't care if she died or not, because there was no clear way to tell if she did. But I wouldn't be surprised. It was kind of a dark movie. It's like I think that was what happened. But they use the story of a character's death in different ways than how they did it in those days. In those days, it was just like off on the side. It's not important. It's not as important as like the fact that like Dracula died. Like he was an incident like that just in his wake. But that's what it felt like. It seemed like they didn't care, but like so it was unclear. But I think you're right. I think he did die.
Well, I kind of figured that she did, because this is supposed to be a horror movie, and one of the reasons that I don't really like horror movies is that they tend to have really bad endings. So I've just figured that she died. I guess it didn't bother me too much because it was really hard to like make some kind of a connection with any of the characters. So I wasn't like totally invested in their relationship. So I wasn't like devastated that she died. I just was like, oh yeah, well, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what? That's how I feel about a lot of silent movies from the 1920s. It's like it's hard for me to connect with any characters from a lot of older movies because it was in those days they were trying to figure out the way to make films. At the same time, they were trying to figure out how to tell stories, and so and making films was such a new thing that like a lot of films in the old days focused more on the technique than the actual building of like a world and characters. And so, and I actually, I'm not a big fan of horror movies either, just like you, but a lot of comedies from the 20s, the kind of stuff that stars people like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, those movies usually hold up more than like dramas.
Mm-hmm.
So those are usually the ones. Those are usually the ones from the 20s that I like more. So it's not as if Nosferatu is like my favorite thing, but I do like its place in like horror movie history as kind of like influential like harbinger of what the genre was going to turn into over the decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I could tell, even though I wasn't really loving it, I could tell that it was an influential and important film to film history.
Yeah, and I like talking about those movies because like because I love film history so much, and that was the main reason why I wanted to talk about it with you, because I liked how it was kind of like a milestone in film history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me for this. Do you want to let people know how they can find you online?
Yeah, if you want to find me online, go to Twitter and type in @eJunkie2014. And if you find me there, I'll give you the links to everywhere else I am on the internet.
And I'll have links down in my description of the podcast and the YouTube video as well.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me. Thanks again to Eli for joining me on this episode. I'll have his links in the description if you want to check out more of his stuff. Like I said in the last episode, I'm taking it a bit lighter this month. For some reason, August just ended up being super busy for me. But I do still have a couple more episodes planned for the month, the next 2 episodes of the Disney Movie Marathon. Next time, my cousin Sarah is joining me to talk about the 1941 Disney classic Dumbo, and then following that, my friend Rachel will be joining me to talk about this year's live-action remake by Tim Burton. I love talking about these Disney films, the good and the bad, so we'll see you next time on the iHeart Podcast. Thanks for listening.